Hello, my name's Dave Millard from the University of Southampton, and this video is a presentation that I gave at the Narrative and Hypertext Workshop at ACM Hypertext 2022. The workshop was focused on a new book called The Authoring Problem, and I have a chapter in that book all about structural patterns in IDN, which is kind of a review of the structural patterns that have been around over the last 30 or 40 years. And my position paper for the workshop was looking at how we might use some of those patterns within authoring tools themselves. So in terms of the patterns, the chapter identifies broadly three different types of patterns. So the first set is micro patterns. So these are very small structures that kind of act as the building blocks of our IDNs. The most obvious example would be links, but you can trace this right back to Vannevar Bush and his idea of tours or trails. And you also might think about more recent structures like storylets. The point about micropatterns is that they kind of come together to define a sort of a form in IDN. So a combination of links, well, that produces a calligraphic hypertext. A combination of storylets, that produces a sculptural hypertext. So those links are all combined together and they produce a larger structure. So if we take links as the example of the micropatterns, we might get a graph. And within this graph, we can see our second set of patterns. These are meso patterns. And meso patterns are normally used to create some kind of effect for the reader. So for example, in this graph, we can see two. We've got a split join at the top. That's where the user makes a decision and then the story goes in one of two directions and that choice is resolved and then it comes back together again to rejoin the main story, and that kind of prevents a combinatorial explosion of possibilities within your story. And then down the bottom here we have a cycle. So this is a series of nodes where you can continually visit and then revisit those nodes. But every time you revisit a node, you have the experience of seeing other material before you've reread it. So your interpretation of that node changes. So meso patterns are very good for resolving certain effects. The last type of pattern we identified in the chapter were macro patterns. So this is a pattern that describes the overall structure of an entire IDN. So if you take our graph from the meso example and we sort of straighten it out, we can see that it, broadly speaking, resembles one of Sam Ashwell's gauntlet patterns. So a gauntlet has a starting point and one or multiple endpoints, but if there's multiple endpoints, the decision is normally quite late in the story. But it essentially represents a linear story with some sort of derivations from the path. So our split join at the beginning is one example of that, and the cycle that we get towards the end is another. Now, macro patterns kind of try to capture a sort of a broad sense of what the user experience is like, particularly in terms of the level of agency that they get within a story. So why would we use patterns in authoring? And in particular, I'm thinking about high-level patterns, so the meso and macro patterns. Now, what are the advantages? Within the paper, I outlined three potential benefits. The first one is that patterns can inform authors of common solutions to problems. So, for example, the split join being a way to manage agency and manage the kind of explosion of content that creates. The second benefit is it might provide a way to create complex structure more quickly. So just in the way that I can create links, well, perhaps I could, with a single click, create a cycle, for example. And the third benefit is that they might give me a way of reflecting on the structure that I've already got. So if I've already created my hypertext, and within that graph I have a cycle, for example, then the application might want to point that out to me so that I can realize that it's a cycle and I can look at the nodes within that cycle and try to understand what the effect of rereading them might be. In the end, I ended up looking at 6 different ways or mechanisms in which patterns might be included into authoring tools. And for each one, I looked at whether or not it would help inform authors, help them create the patterns, or help them reflect on what they've done already. I also looked at uncommon patterns. So uncommon patterns are patterns that reoccur within a single piece of work, but don't occur between multiple works. In other words, they're unique or almost unique to a particular piece. And some of these methods support uncommon patterns and some of them don't. So the mechanisms I looked at were including patterns by design. So that means modifying the user interface of the authoring tool so that it incorporates the patterns that are sort of built into the authoring tool. So an example of that would be in story places, where we had a pattern where a node, once it's read, can't be revisited, and we incorporated that into the authoring tool by simply having a toggle on the node page, and you flick the toggle, and that means that once that node's been reread, once it's been read rather, it can't be reread. A cookbook, well, that's quite familiar to many of us. Typically, that's a set of documentation that sits independently of the application. It might be on a website, for example, and it describes common problems and common solutions to those problems, perhaps actually giving examples of those solutions within the cookbook. A domain-specific language is a scripting language that uses the terminology of the domain, of the IDN, that lets you create structures and create functions and build up things in that way. A template is a kind of a structure which you can define once and then sort of stamp it out whenever you need it. And cut and paste is a variation of template, where instead of defining the structure as a template, you simply select it within your bigger structure. So you select a substructure and then cut and paste that to create new instances of structure. And then structural parser was inspired by the idea of a spatial parser. So a spatial parser is in a spatial hypertext where you might have a canvas where, let's say I were to arrange 3 nodes in a row somewhere, then the spatial parser would say, that must be a list, and it would identify it as being a list. Well, a structural parser does the same thing, but in a graph. So I create my hypertext as normal, and then what it does is it looks for patterns within that graph. So it looks for loops, it looks for cycles, it looks for split joins, and then it identifies them to me and points them out to me. Now, I'm not going to go into the in-depth analysis of each of these. You can read the paper for that. But I think the key takeaway is that none of them actually provide support for all of the things that we've been talking about. So, for example, if I were to incorporate patterns into my application by design, well, it certainly lets you create patterns very easily. And it sort of informs you about them, although that's obfuscated because they're as part of the UI and your attention isn't drawn to them explicitly. But it doesn't really help you reflect on what you've done, and it certainly doesn't support uncommon patterns because only the things that are built into the interface are supported. Whereas if you take a cookbook, well, that's very good at informing you of the sorts of things you could do, but it sort of only indirectly helps you create things. You might cut and paste from the cookbook into your own work, for example. And similarly, it doesn't really directly help you reflect, although you might compare what you have done to what was in the cookbook. So one of the things we can do is we can combine these mechanisms together to solve some of these problems. So if I take the two that I just went through, if I have a cookbook and I include some things into the interface, then the things in the interface enable me to create patterns very easily, and the cookbook will then inform me about what I've then done. So I get some of the benefits from both by combining them together. Similarly, if I have a DSL, so a domain-specific language, that doesn't really help me, doesn't really inform me about the sorts of ways of solving problems, but I could combine that with a cookbook to do that, and the cookbook would show me how to achieve certain aims with the DSL. And templates. Templates are very good. They're really good at informing you about different structures and helping you create things, but they don't really help you reflect on what you've done. Whereas a structural parser, that's very good at helping you reflect on what you've done, but doesn't help you create things. So if you combine the two together, you actually get the best of all worlds. So in summary, in my chapter, what I did was explain a range of different patterns. I've identified 60 or 70 different patterns. Some of them are micro patterns, these kind of building blocks that make up the form of an IDN. Some of them meso patterns, these kind of mid-level structures that create a certain effect within the story. And some of them are macro patterns. They kind of define the overall shape of the story and help you understand the user experience and get a sense of the sort of agency that readers have. I then looked at a number of benefits of incorporating those into authoring tools. They can help inform authors about solutions to problems, help create complex structures quickly, help reflect on what they've done already, and also they may or may not support uncommon patterns. And then we looked at a range of different mechanisms, and we saw that while none of those mechanisms support everything, by combining some of those mechanisms together, you could potentially get multiple benefits. So I think what this work shows us is there's a huge amount of potential in using patterns for authoring tools, and it's definitely something that we should, as a community, be exploring in the future. Thank you very much for listening.